Back while Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues and talks between the two countries, Russia and Ukraine, also due to continue, there is now a renewed focus on the attitude of China to this particular conflict. China has described Russia as a close ally. In the last week, the US has claimed that Russia has asked China for military help during this invasion. Both China and Russia have denied that. Then today, it seems that the Chinese foreign minister told the Spanish foreign minister that he did not want sanctions to be imposed on China. They also reject sanctions as an international tool. Faith Mabera is a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Faith, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. Is it possible to know how China really feels about this invasion? In a way, it seems they're not pleased, and they're not going to say that they're displeased. How do you assess it?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewers. Thank you for having me. Yes, it's certainly a very interesting position, especially when one begins to take stock of what was just early last month, a declaration of a no-limits partnership, this idea of a strategic coordination and cooperation between Russia and China, just as we saw the beginning of the Beijing Olympics. And that almost set the tone for what many would imagine would be a very rock-solid relationship between Moscow and Beijing. But as you've rightly said, it's interesting also when you take into account just the kind of almost pressure that Washington sort of wants to edge and drive a wedge between the two, between Russia and China, but Russia is not capitulating to that. But what's interesting is that China stands, I think I'd want to call it a very pragmatic neutrality. And it's pragmatic because of several reasons, rather. China is actually, in a way, using the narrative of the war in Ukraine to advance its own interest. And there are two points to this. The first is that we've seen statements from the Chinese foreign minister recently almost picturing or portraying the Quad as a kind of Asian NATO, if you will, and that has a certain messaging value to the West, and it's sort of geopolitical hot point in the Indo-Pacific. So that's one element. The second, it's also using the whole furor over Ukraine and the discovery, for instance, of biolabs, which the US has said is now in the hands of Russia. It's using that particular debacle also to advance its own narratives, because it's almost one way of pivoting around the conspiracy lab leak theory that we saw as pertains to the coronavirus pandemic. So that's one element. On the other hand, the pragmatism for me comes in the sense that there is what we have in place is a very interconnected global economy. So while there's antagonism between the West, the US-led West, and Russia on one hand, and also antagonism and tensions with China as a result of systemic rivalry, the antagonisms with China are far less acute than Russia's antagonism with the West. China has expressed its displeasure with the invasion, and it's also seeking to protect its own reputation, but it will not endanger its place in the world economy. The fact that it still has its reserves in what is a very Western-aligned global economy, it will not risk that very strategic position in danger of almost shifting towards supporting wholesale support of Russia in the military sense of the word. And I think it's important that we also unlock a bit of what kind of partnership China and Russia has. Yes, there's been increased trade between the two. There's been a redirection of goods and commerce between the two, but it's being very careful to walk a fine line between the two axes, I would say.
One of the reasons the US and other Western countries have imposed such strong sanctions against Russia has been partly because they can at a little bit of cost to the West. Now look, if you're in Germany or Britain in the middle of winter there and you need Russian gas, it's quite a high cost. But if the West were to impose, if the United States were to impose that kind of sanction on China, it would really hurt the United States too. But it would also really hurt China. I mean, look, China has an internal market of 1.4 billion people. But if you look at how the Russian economy is predicted to shrink this year, more than 10%, perhaps 15%, perhaps 20% because of the impact of those sanctions, how much of what the US has done in leading these sanctions against Russia is actually about sending a message to China. Don't invade Taiwan, we'll do this to you too.
It also calls to question the idea of when we look at certain strategic turning points, particularly, and I'd say pivotal moments in China's trajectory or China's grand strategy. And it's interesting that you bring up the question of Taiwan, because in as much as there's been a concern about whether the invasion of Ukraine portends an imminent invasion of Taiwan by China, I think for now there's no need to sort of get into a bit of a panic just yet. And there's two reasons for this. President Xi Jinping is calculating, and he's keen to remain on top of the Chinese Communist Party. He's keen to ensure that the CCP remains in place. So we'll be going into the National Congress session just at the end of this year. And also there's calculations about, like you're saying, the fact that sanctions are now trying to maximize the cost or put a pressure point on Russia to sort of pull back and reconsider its military adventure. The same sort of lessons are being taken by China, but it's a different sort of set of cards, I would say, just because of also the kind of sort of setup that we have when you look at Taiwan and the case of the kind of almost strategic implications an invasion would have just from a military science and military strategic perspective. That's one element. And the second would be at this moment in time, like I said, the timing, even if there were projections for invasion, would not work in Beijing's favor at this time. So it's a case of almost hedging its bets and looking for an ideal time. And I don't think at this juncture it's ideal for those kinds of adventurism or kind of territorial sort of engagement on Chinese part at this point. So those are some of the strategic considerations that I would venture going on in sort of Beijing's calculations and calculus as far as Taiwan is considered. And you're right in saying that there are certain costs that the Europe, for instance, would have to bear. We're actually going to see this get much worse because already inflations are at sky high. But should this go on further, just because there's certain ripple effects in cutting off a G20 economy, Russia being a G20 economy, being the 11th largest economy in the world, there are certain implications that come with cutting it off in terms of the pressure that we've seen with sanctions. And that the ripple effects are what you're saying, what you've just said, Stephen, that we're likely to even see double-digit inflation in Europe. So it's almost akin to that famous Chinese saying where the enemy is trying to get a stone and to set it on another, but it ends up dropping the stone on your own toes. So I think this is what is happening in terms of just the long-term effect. So we're likely to see how this plays out, but in a very interconnected global economy, it's going to be painful in the long run.
Yeah, we're also living in interesting times, so sort of continue the illusion. There's been some discussion in the past, and let me sort of explain where I'm going with this, that if you look at countries by the size of their economy, some countries play a much bigger role in international relations, either at the United Nations, and I don't just mean at the Security Council, I mean actively sending soldiers for peacekeeping, foreign aid, etc., etc., etc. So the United States, obviously, Russia has been involved in places like Syria. China hasn't really done that, particularly as it's grown richer and richer over the last 20 years, now the second biggest economy in the world. It hasn't really got very involved in international relations. It has, of course, in the Pacific. It's made certain comments, etc. Could this be a moment where China, if it wanted to, could perhaps try to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine, or if you prefer, between Russia and the West? Or is that actually just not going to happen? Is China just not that interested? There's nothing in it for China to do that at this stage.
At this moment, I think it's going to try and sort of diffuse the tension because just of the kind of ripple effects that we've alluded to in terms of the global economy, which also it's not immune to. So that's one element of it. But on the question of mediation, that's an interesting point because I'm of the opinion that, interestingly, we seem to see very interesting polls emerging, very interesting interlocutors emerging. And another sort of actor that seems to be featuring along the talk of negotiations is the role that Israel is likely going to play, because it certainly had an overture towards Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who's almost is a bit more inclined towards letting Israel, and perhaps with the involvement of Turkey's as a diplomatic back channel in securing mediation between the two. But ultimately, the question of mediation boils down to the question of whether Putin is even keen to get to the negotiating table at this juncture, because it's not a case of where there's a mutually hurting stalemate. It's also the question of whether Putin is gunning for a very decisive military victory at this time. It's a very fluid, it's very difficult to predict where this will go. But at the moment, it seems that when we weigh sort of the scales, it seems that there's a lot of more better alternatives other than negotiations that seem to be in the foreground much more than the mediation element. And that explains why conflict is ongoing in terms of facts on the ground. So China, I would argue, has influence in a couple of strands. Certainly, even in peacekeeping, actually, Stephen, China is now the second largest financial contributor to peacekeeping after the U.S. It also increased its footprint in terms of not only the financial aspect, but also in sort of putting its money where its mouth is in delivering also troops contributing countries in terms of the UN multilateral peacekeeping. So it's wants to ensure that it stays the script in terms of projecting its image as a responsible great power. And I think that's the kind of sort of logic that will inform its actions going forward as far as the Ukraine-Russia war is concerned. It's this idea of it seeking to protect its reputation, and it's also seeking to ensure that there's a balance as far as the stakes to its economy are concerned.
There's so much to talk about with this. Faith, there's been a lot of commentary coming from the United States, certain Western scholars, people like Francis Fukuyama, who claim that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to re-energize and reunite the West. It's going to lead to more defense spending by the United States, Germany, France, for example, and that the West is going to get stronger as a result, be able to put more pressure on China as a result. Do you buy that, or they're just being, what's the word, jingoistic?
It's a case, I think, of also geopolitical opportunism to an extent. And if you want to play devil's advocate to the idea of almost an unintended consequence of the invasion, being that the invasion has sort of galvanized European solidarity, galvanized the transatlantic alliance, and sort of reinvigorated NATO's purpose. To be a devil's advocate would be, is this perhaps not almost a kind of knee-jerk reaction, if you will, to an earth-shattering? That's the sheer terror of having a threat so close to your frontiers in the form of an imperialist Russia with grand ambitions. That could also be a case of an animating factor that has informed the West response. To their credit, yes, perhaps Putin was not expecting that this would be the response. But I think the long game has been that for decades now, I mean, since the initial warning by Putin to the West, as far back as 2008, even at the Munich Security Conference about NATO's expansion eastward, and how there's just been almost a lag, just delay in taking decisive action, this over-reliance on the U.S., and now, like you're rightfully saying, there's been almost an indication that European security order is being reframed and it's being recalibrated. And this if you take the cue, for instance, of Germany just doubling down on its defense spending, that's indicative of just the surge in global militarism, but it's also a response to what is deemed as an existential threat, what is deemed as a threat to national imperatives and national security interests. So that's one level of it. The other is that, yes, the two are related in terms of the China question and the Russia question. It's related in the sense that when we look at the broader structural shifts in the global order, then we're beginning to see what is firmly the end of, I would say, almost 500 years of Western hegemony. We're likely to see what is the shaping of a multipolarity in the sure sense of the word. I'd say, and that's the grand shift that we are seeing in terms of the distribution of power and also in terms of the economic implications of a very fragmented global economy going forward.
Faith Mabera, so much more to talk about. Really appreciate the time. Senior Researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Thanks very much indeed. Not going to make any comments about Munich and security conferences.